I'm going to show you 5 tips to instantly improve your wood finish on your projects, specifically on pine projects like most of us use starting out. There's certain things you need to do to make sure you get that flawless finish. I recently built this table. It's all out of pine from Home Depot. Most of all my projects that I made on the channel have been out of pine. I built hundreds of these projects over the years, from stove covers to tables, and I've learned some valuable lessons on what not to do. And today I'm going to share with you those 5 tips. Let's go. Before I show you how to finish this table, if you want to build one just like it, I have plans available for this and many other things on our website. Go to 731woodworks.com/store and check those out. If you use the code FINISH, I'll give you 20% off any order, including these little table plans. And if you're interested in any of the supplies or tools you see used today, I'll put links in the description and the pinned comment so you can go check them out for yourself. Number 1, you absolutely have to make sure all of the wood glue is properly cleaned up. And we're going to show you how to do that. But I'm going to leave some of mine on there to show you what happens if you don't. So during assembly of the table, you may see glue squeeze out or something like that. You can see it here, but sometimes, depending on the color of the glue and the species of wood, you may not see that squeeze out. But anytime you use wood glue and there's a joint, then you need to make sure that that's properly cleaned up. It's easier to clean up during assembly. Just take a damp cloth and wipe that off, and that will pretty much get rid of all the glue. And then also when you're sanding, you're going to make sure that you get those spots. Another caution is sometimes you get wood glue on your finger and you hold the piece of wood, and whenever you go to stain or put your finish on, that's when you see it. A lot of times you don't see it before then, and that's when your heart just sinks. Just for demonstrations, I did put a little wood glue on my thumb and touch the side of the tabletop just to show you what it's going to look like after we finish this. You're going to see how that changes things when you put your finish on. Tip number 2, if you want to make this look very professional, like you absolutely knew what you were doing, is fill the knot holes and the voids in the wood before you sand it. This is really easy, and it's specifically made easy because of a company like Starbond. They have CA glues, which are basically colored glues that dry extremely fast. Now, I've used them on a ton of projects before. I've even made a couple of specific videos on how to use them, but I'm gonna show you really quick how easy it is and why you should do it. When picking out the color that you're gonna fill these knot holes, you need to know what color you're going to be staining with. Now, I know that I'm going to be staining with dark walnut for the top, but if you're picking a lighter color, you may want to go with a lighter colored CA glue. Or if you're just going to be painting this, it really doesn't matter if it's clear or black or anything like that. The darker the color, the darker the wood glue. It'll make it blend and look more natural. This stuff is very affordable and very easy to use. We got a knot hole there. You can fill the crevice in there or the void. And all we're going to do is squeeze that into that void. I like the medium thick for these purposes. It's not too thin, not too thick. Goldilocks, just right. Just going to put a little dab on there. And then you'll also get some activator, and you'll spray that activator on there, and that's just going to make that dry within about 30 seconds. We have several of these knot holes up here that we're just going to do the same thing. This one actually goes all the way around it, so we'll just apply the CA glue around the knot. Now, one of the main reasons you want to do that is to prevent that knot from working its way out later. I have seen that happen. You finish the project and that knot hole is actually loose and you don't know it, and then it pops out. You don't want that happening on your customer or on your project. So go ahead and this is going to seal those in. A little bit of this stuff goes a very long way. I'll drop a link in the description below to my favorites. Another good reason to fill knot holes is to prevent that from splitting as it ages. You can see that one has split in 3 different directions. This will just bind all that together and keep it from splitting out later. Number 3 on the list is sanding. Nobody likes sanding for the most part, but it's an essential step to get that perfect, flawless finish. We put that CA glue on there. We're going to make sure that's nice and smooth. For the most part, on sanding, when you sand things, don't put too much pressure down on your sander because that will create those swirl marks that we all hate. And just make sure that you get all your saw marks and things like that off of there. If you don't, you'll see them, especially if you're staining, you'll see those saw marks left in the edges of your wood. On the edges of your wood, if you hit that with a regular sander, it's going to deform that, especially if you've used roundovers. So I highly recommend using like a contour pad. This is the one I use, and it just basically forms around the edge of that profile so it doesn't damage it. It just sands it smooth. What I like to do after I get through sanding with my orbital sander is I'll take something like this sanding mouse and go with the grain just to give it a final sand at 220. I always sand with the orbital sander at 120. I rarely go above 120 on furniture pieces. But on the sanding block, I'll put a piece of 220 grit on there and just sand with the grain on all the surfaces. That just helps remove any of those sanding marks that may have been there. But if you use like a 80 grit, 60 grit, something like that, That's going to put a lot of deep scratches, especially in softwoods like pine. That's why I highly recommend staying at 120 grit or above. Another thing you want to be sure and look for are clamping marks. In other words, where you've clamped the boards down, you may see where your F-clamps have indented the wood a little bit, or any type of clamp you're using really, you'll see that circle or those half circles. You want to make sure that you get those sanded off, because if you don't, they'll absolutely show up in the stain, which I'll show you in a little bit. After you get through sanding, you absolutely want to make sure just take your shop vac or whatever and vacuum up any of the bigger loose dust you can get. And then I highly recommend a microfiber cloth like these. They're very inexpensive and they remove a lot of the dust that you can't see, and you will not remove if you just move your hand or a vacuum across the surface. You can see here how much dust came up just from the top. We'll wipe the whole surface down before we move on to step number 4. If you skip this part and if you don't remove the dust, especially from the top, when you put your finish on, that dust will get embedded into there and it'll be very difficult to get off later. In other words, when people touch the top of your product or your surface of your table, they'll feel that bumpy, gritty feeling. You don't want that. Step number 4, before you stain it, you want to wipe everything down with mineral spirits. This is also going to remove some of that dust from the previous step, but it's also going to reveal some things to you. A lot of times if you wipe this down, you'll see where you've got sanding marks, those swirl marks, and where you've left the glue, like you see here. This is 4B. This is still part of the staining process and essential on softwoods in my opinion. I've stained dozens of projects without this stuff and hundreds of projects with this pre-stain conditioner from Minwax, and this stuff works. Some people say this mineral spirits and this are the same thing, but I just disagree. What this will do is remove the blotchiness or the miscolorations in wood. A lot of times when you stain pine, you'll see some really nasty looking dark spots and things like that. This helps prevent that. It's a good idea here to put some gloves on. This is very simple to apply. You're just going to take a terry cloth and dampen it and wipe the entire project down. And this will take about 30 or 45 minutes to dry after you wipe it on, and then we'll move on to 4C, staining. And 4C, I think is where we're at. We're just gonna put stain on. There's no magic secret to putting stain on. I do recommend the best applicator for stain, in my opinion, are old t-shirts, like old white t-shirts, like undershirts, because they don't have any lint, things like that. A terry cloth also works well, which I'm using here. The only thing to be cautious with on terry cloths is sometimes they will kind of snag in any splinter that may be there. When applying stain to the underside where you have pocket holes, like in this project, the good old-fashioned Q-tip, aka cotton swab if you don't use Q-tip brand, you'll just dip it into the stain and then run it into the pocket hole. This is by far the easiest way to stain inside pocket holes, and I recommend putting stain in there. One, it helps seal it, but most importantly, it makes it look better to your customer if they ever look underneath the piece of furniture. That way it's just not an unstained piece there. As far as applying stain goes, I always like to put it on the underside first and then the top side, and then you'll want to let your stain dry about 24 hours before we move to the next step. Wipe it on fairly liberally. You don't want it pooling up. I think a lot of people make a mistake by putting too much stain on, and that's really not the purpose of stain. It's just to stain the wood. It's not really to flood the wood. It's not like an oil finish where you're dipping a cutting board or something like that into mineral oil and it's soaking into the grain for a period of time. That's not what stain is for. Stain is just to color the wood to the color you want. It's basically painting it, but not. And you may notice some dark splotches here, and that's what you'll see when you don't use pre-stain. Once I get it coated, I'll take a clean part of the rag and just wipe lightly any excess, and then we'll move on to the edges before we flip it over. I like these little Craig blocks because they have these little rubber nibs on there, and that prevents this from sliding around while I'm trying to stain something like this. Anytime you have a crack or a gap, you want to put a little extra in there to let that finish soak into that, just so that it all colors it up right. Now this is extremely important, extremely important. Listen, do not throw this in a trash can or in the corner of your shop or anything like this. These can actually self-combust in the right conditions, so make sure to dispose of these properly. What I like to do is take an old stain rag, I set it away from the house, outdoors, for a couple of days, and then I discard it in the outdoor trash can. I do not put these in the trash can in my house or in the shop, or just leave them laying around. Never do that with stained or oily rags. Now we just applied the stain to the top and we have a problem. Remember, I talked about sanding marks as well as glue marks. This is where you will see those. I bared down on the sander on purpose to show you what will happen if you push down too much pressure and you don't sand that off with that sanding block. You can see those little swirlies. That's from the sander, as well as on the same edge I did the same thing, and you can see those swirlies there. And while that's not a huge deal, it will hurt your feelings, especially if it's on a large project and you have a bunch of them. If you remember where I put my thumb in the glue and accidentally touched the top, then you're going to see that come out in a lighter spot in your stain. If you see this on any of your project where there's a light spot, that's wood glue. And that's what the wood glue has already filled the pores of that wood, and the stain couldn't soak in there. So you're going to see that lighter spot, and that's going to really hurt your feelings. Now you can fix that, but you have to sand off the stain off of that edge or wherever that glue spot is. If it's on the top, you have to sand that back off. If it's on the top, pretty much you have to sand a large area because you want everything to mix and blend back together. So in this case, this tabletop here, if I had a glue spot on top, I would sand the whole thing back off and repeat the whole staining process. For the edge, you can just sand this edge, then stain it again. When staining or painting the base, always turn it upside down and paint and or stain the bottom side, then we flip it over and do the top side. It's much easier that way. Now I've applied this lighter color stain to the base and I can already see the flaws because the stain will highlight anything you've done wrong. There is a clamp mark. There is a clamp mark. You can also see the swirlies right there. And then if you'll take notice of the back side of these, I did not apply pre-stain conditioner. They're much darker and more blotchy than the front side. And now you can really see those saw marks that I was pointing out earlier. They were difficult to see before the stain was applied, but now that the stain is applied, you can clearly see them. And a couple of places that the glue wasn't cleaned up on purpose again. You can see right there that very light spot. Also, you might can see it right there along that crease or along that seam, but it really is pronounced here. The color isn't taking to the wood the same as the surrounding areas because that glue's blocking it. And that's why it's so important. That's one of the main things that you have to do and have to look for when building stuff like this. It's just to clean up those edges. Again, a damp cloth after you put everything together, just wipe it in that crease, it'll take care of it. You don't have to worry about it after that. But if you don't clean it up, or if you get some on your thumb and touch the project, then it's going to show up. Another thing you may notice are these horizontal lines that run down boards like this. That's the face of the board. Even on these raw 2x6s, that's what I use to build that. You can see those vertical or those lines on this one. I'm not sure how much it's showing up on camera, but you can see those there. That's where it was planed at the factory, and if you don't sand it, then it'll show up in your finish. Typically what I like to do is just spray the bottom first, and that's going to include the inside of all those legs and everything that I can get from this angle. And then after that dries, it only takes lacquer probably 5 or 10 minutes to dry before you can touch it. And then I'll flip it over and do the top side, and we're going to put about 3 coats of lacquer on there. The reason I like lacquer is because each coat bonds to the coat that you previously put on there, and it creates a very hard and durable surface. I used lacquer on my desk build that I did a while back, and it has held up extremely well, even using a mouse on there without a mouse pad. So that has wore very well. For a long time, I used to use polyurethane, specifically water-based polyurethane over oil-based stains. Yes, you can do that, and it doesn't hurt anything, so long as the stain cures about 24 hours. However, it takes longer for it to cure between coats, and it's a little harder to get a flawless finish like you can with lacquer. Lacquer is my favorite go-to finish of any finish that you can use on furniture, especially tabletops and things like that, because it's so durable, and for a beginner, it's very easy to apply. All you have to do is spray it on. Now, I like using these rattle cans for small projects, but I have used an HVLP gun with a little bit of lacquer mixed with lacquer thinner. I've got a video on that on my desk build. I'll link in the description, as well as a link to the polyurethane video if you like using that. So I like to put 2 coats of lacquer on, and I'm waiting about 30 minutes between each coat. And then before I put the final coat on, I'm going to take 320 grit sandpaper, very lightly sand the top of this, and just remove any bumps or anything that you may feel in that. And then we're going to wipe that down with a microfiber cloth. Then we're going to spray our final coat of lacquer. This stuff is so easy to apply. Anybody can do it. What you never want to do is spray lacquer in an enclosed environment such as a garage, which is why you see me outside. Fumes will come off of this thing, and it makes it very difficult to breathe, and it's quite dangerous actually. So don't breathe this stuff in without a respirator if you're going to spray it inside. I prefer to bring everything outside to spray it. A couple of quick tips on lacquer is you don't want to spray too heavy. In other words, don't make it pull up or drip. And all you're doing is putting a very light coat. I used to hold the can about 6 or 8 inches away, and then just make equal passes or even passes on there. Super easy to do, and it'll come out nice and flawless. Just don't stop and cause a puddle. Also, I'm using satin here. You can get gloss, but I prefer the satin. It just looks more natural. After the final coat, I let that dry for about 30 minutes before I bring it back inside. At that point, As long as the temperature is above 50 degrees, it should be dry, and you'll be able to tell if it's tacky or damp feeling or even sticky feeling. If it's not, then it's dry and ready to come in. Now wait about 24 hours before you set anything on top of that, like a cup or a lamp or a plant or whatever you've built this table for. Overall, the table looks fairly nice, even with the on-purpose mistakes that I put into this to show you what not to do. However, if you take the time and do it properly, it'll look that much better, which will command a higher price and make your projects look more professional. If you like this video, there's another tips and tricks video right there you gotta go check out. It's gonna help you out. Click at the box to get to the big old virtual fist bump. Also, another one of my favorite videos right there.